Calling yourself a liberal at this point can really mean anything. Are you woke? Are you in support of the status quo? Or are you just supporting an ideology like a football club? It all kind of seems to be muddled for liberalism, but Bell suggests there's a reason for this in the development of liberalism in the UK and the US, but I'm mainly going to focus on the UK example for the sake of clarity. I've also given Bell's take a little bit more historical information and come to some of my own conclusions, but the general flow of the video follows Bell's article, and I want to give him credit for that. Modern liberalism in the UK generally claims that it has its roots as an Enlightenment ideology developing 400 years ago, but Bell finds that the beginning of the term liberal actually being used is more accurately around 200 years old and was an insult by the Tories, the UK Conservative Party, against the Whigs, who are a party that's not really around anymore. The term liberal was specifically a reference to the Spanish liberales, who by Tory standards were viewed as these radicals who were in support of parliamentary democracy and social equality. So the term liberal was kind of used in the same way that a right-winger might use the term Marxist for anything left of Trump. But the Whigs never really even accepted the term liberal outright. The Whigs were for parliamentary power rather than the Tory-supported monarchy, but the Whigs were generally aristocrats looking to put power into Parliament so that they themselves could control things. So this isn't exactly the story of the Whigs being in support of true democracy. Many Whigs were elected through very limited voting rights, and many of the borough elections that happened were effectively decided by one family in the borough. These were known as Rawdon boroughs. And to be fair, there were some Whigs who would become more committed to democratic ideals, starting to support reform of the electoral system fairly authentically. But we can say that generally that wasn't the case for many Whigs. Aside from that, the term liberal would eventually be claimed by a split off of the Whigs who were slightly more radical and did align with the political values of the Spanish liberales, advocating for more egalitarianism and liberty for everyone through a democratic, anti-revolutionary method, hoping to expand voting rights to the middle class man, as at this point, the only people who could really vote were the upper class who had a lot of property. The Tories represented those people who were extremely traditionalist, advocating for only the very necessary changes to be made, but effectively wanted to keep religious and the economic status quo. These guys were generally influenced by a guy called Edmund Burke, the kind of father of conservatism in the UK at least, while we could say the Whigs were more for the idea of limited natural individual rights established in a constitution with a parliamentary system of government protecting those rights. These guys were generally influenced by the thoughts of John Locke. So, in one sense, the Liberals of this time were radically positioned in contrast to the Tories and the Whigs, but on a wider scale, less radical than, say, the revolutionaries, inspired by events in France where things got a little bit fast and loose with the guillotine. It wouldn't be long before in Parliament a liberal faction was formed, which was made up through a combination of Whigs, a faction of free trade Tories, and some free trade radicals. But this wasn't an actual political party. It was simply a loose faction of people who sometimes had aligning views. Those who claimed the title liberal on a personal level would have been advocating for a kind of general social equality, liberty, and also free trade. So within Parliament, the eclectic liberal faction had one thing tying them together consistently, and it was free trade, which was seen as feeding the ongoing industrialization in the UK and the emerging capitalist economic system. The Whigs' reform, which expanded the vote to the middle class, allowed for industrial towns to have much more of a say, and somewhat ironically for the Whigs, their reforms to the electoral system, allowing the middle class to vote, allowed for industrial towns to have much more of a say on how things were done, as more people in those areas were entering the middle class through a new industrial organization. Worth saying as well at this point that capitalism was still in its teenage years and actually posed itself as a more equitable system for a larger group of people than the previous system had done. Even with this faction in Parliament, self-identified liberals were still somewhat marginal until it ended up being able to define itself against the growing socialist working class labor movement, who did have revolutionary intents. This cast the liberals now as the representatives of the emergent middle class, wanting less radical change than the working class movement, but still advocating for more change than the traditional Tories. Meanwhile, the original Whig Party kind of fades into the background in this period, not really representing any particular group, as their Lockean ideals were going out of fashion, some saying that the idea of natural individual rights and contractualism was simply a product of the time that they were in and no longer applied, as Whiggism was dying. That liberalism was being linked with democracy, utilitarianism, individualism, represented by thinkers like Mills and Bentham, both of whom disagreed at least partially with John Locke's project. And this comes about with the establishment of the Liberal Party becoming the main competitor to the Tories in the UK Parliament, fighting to see expanded free trade, less taxation on the middle and working class, while also supporting individual freedoms. This was the beginning of laissez-faire liberalism, which was very intent on supporting the growth of capitalism. This newly dominant liberalism was so successful that the Tories themselves had to kind of abandon their conservative beliefs in some cases and adopt a support for capitalism, liberalism, and democracy, now labeling themselves as one nation conservatism. These two now liberally inclined ideologies that battled it out within the UK Parliament became politically represented by the prime ministerial battle between the Liberal William Gladstone and the One Nation Benjamin Disraeli. And it's in this period where broad liberalism looks like the only real avenue for political success in the capitalist, kind of democratic UK, having defeated most of its rivals. But this all flips for liberalism as we get into the 20th century with the rise of far-right and far-left governments across Europe in communism and fascism, respectively. This also coincides with liberalism in the UK seeming to lose its foothold in Parliament to the growing Labour movement, who became the new main opposition to the Tory party, as, ironically again, the Liberals supported the expansion of voting rights to be opened up to the working class and women. And the Liberal Party did stave off this challenge by the Labour movement for a time by making some concessions to the newly voting working class base through a social liberalism represented in the government of David Lloyd George, who kind of laid the groundworkings for the welfare state. But the Liberals, despite this, would slowly lose support and never really make its way back into governmental power again. So liberalism was in crisis both internally and externally. Liberalism then in this period actively understands they need to reinvent themselves, and they do so by going backwards. Liberalism rebrands itself as the other to totalitarianism, tying itself to a new concept called the liberal democracy, which brings about this narrative that the Western states in the US, UK, and Europe are inherently tied to liberalism. The historical narrative of liberalism extends back all the way to the beginnings of the Enlightenment, claiming that John Locke, this whole time, was actually the fundamental pillar of liberalism. The liberalism, which was once looking to completely change the status quo through free trade, was now claiming that natural rights and constitutionalism was always fundamental to their ideology. In this new rebrand, liberalism was the culmination of Western civilization and its protector. With this kind of rebrand, all of a sudden the Tory party, who once used to use liberal as an insult, were actually the new stalwarts of UK liberalism against Labour socialism. And really, it's at this point that liberalism's incoherence really takes a front seat, because the liberalism of Mills and Bentham and Gladstone is still claimed as being the middle part of liberalism's timeline. So now this ideology has to maintain a grand narrative spanning Western civilization's history since the Enlightenment, while also casting itself as the center ground between fascism and communism, and the natural ideology of the Western liberal capitalist democracies. It was in this time that there were even one or two writers who started to claim that really Socrates and Plato were the true hearts of liberalism, forcing liberalism's timeline to actually span effectively across more than 2,000 years. And like I said, this does kind of bring liberalism an incoherence, but at the same time, it actually provides liberalism with quite a big strength, as it gets to claim it's anything it needs to be at any given moment, which only becomes more pronounced. In the UK, there's this push and pull between the traditional Tories and the socialist Labour governments as liberalism begins to reconfigure itself yet again with Margaret Thatcher. There's a story, I'm not sure how accurate it is, but supposedly on Thatcher's first day as leader of the Conservative Party, she slaps down a book on the table called The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. She lets everyone in the room know that this is their new Bible. Hayek and Milton would pull liberal economics to the right, claiming that the true victory of the liberal democracy of the West over communism can only be won by fighting off the planned economy, and you have to do this by implementing the maximum form of free trade in all governmental policy. Meaning that liberalism changed from, at one point, kind of having this general idea that maybe we shouldn't have too much government in the economy. The belief now was going to be that you have to remove as much government as physically possible from everywhere in life and just let the free market work its magic. People might lose their jobs, people might lose their homes, and they might even lose their lives, but it's a worthy price to avoid governmental overstep that could be constituted by the neoliberal as totalitarianism. And Thatcher would dominate British politics for the next 15 years, while Labour lagged behind and communism was extinguishing to the east. Liberalism was in such a full swing that Fukuyama claimed the liberal democracy of the West was the ultimate culmination of human history itself, while in response, Labour becomes dominated by a new leader in itself, Tony Blair, who effectively takes on a slightly nicer version of Thatcher's neoliberalism, which we can maybe call social neoliberalism, and he again dominates British politics for the next 12 years, meaning that, as once happened before, liberalism was now effectively the language of both sides of British politics. It had defeated its internal enemies in the Socialist Labour Party, but also globalized to see capitalism become the only viable economic system in the world. It no longer had any real adversaries. This new liberal high point first starts to show cracks around 2008 with the biggest financial crisis in 100 years. After this, cost of living starts to increase slowly. Housing becomes a commodity with more demand than supply, even though paradoxically the stock market continues to rise. And the neoliberals see the market continue to go up and figure that that's really the only thing that actually matters. Meanwhile, you have right-wing populists clearly stating something is rotten. In the UK case, those right-wing populists will say that it's immigrants and the EU leading to the eventual Brexit vote. And I mean, alongside this, you do have a left-wing populism suggesting maybe something is wrong with turning everything into a market. So neoliberalism just doesn't really seem to have anywhere to go because they are the ones who caused the crisis that the peripheries are now responding to. Effectively, neoliberalism now needs to reconfigure itself again, because that's what liberalism has been, from laissez-faire to social liberalism to liberal democrats to neoliberalism. It has found some opposition to capitalism to configure itself against in the parliamentary democratic system. The question isn't what is liberalism, it is where is liberalism at the moment. Looking at Keir Starmer, it still doesn't know where it is. It lacks a clear form after 40 years of neoliberal rule, 20 of which have been uncontested in the UK at least. It's had effectively no real opposition to form itself against. So if we do take Keir Starmer's government as an example, it ends up looking like it's tripping over liberalism's inherent incoherences rather than shaping itself to be whatever it needs to be at that moment to support general capitalist liberal goals. Meaning liberalism now just has to either change or die.